Welcome to the Small Church Podcast, where faith, community, and ministry intersect in the unique context of smaller congregations. I'm your host, Tony Marr, and I'm thrilled to be joined by two men who are convinced they're a little bit more talented than I am.
That is right. I'm Robert Kell, one of those supposedly more talented guys, co-host and fellow small church leader. Together, we're here to explore the challenges, triumphs, and inspiring stories within the tight-knit communities that make up our smaller churches.
And I'm Bruce Montgomery, the one here to bring even more to the table than these two and offer a unique perspective to our conversation.
So whether you believe this talent hierarchy or not, you're in for a treat. If you're a pastor, a church member, or just curious about the world of leadership, you're in the right place.
Each episode, we dive into topics that matter to you, from innovative ministry ideas to navigating the unique dynamics of a smaller congregation.
So grab your cup of coffee, settle in, and let's journey together through the wonderful tapestry of small church life.
This is the Small Church Podcast.
Good morning, gentlemen.
What is up?
It's been a while.
It's been too long.
So our listeners don't know this because we have an episode every week that airs, but
And they're not creepy like me that I stalk podcasters, so they have no clue where we live and what we do, and I might stalk a podcaster or two occasionally. So
I'm a little creeped out right now. But yeah, we missed recording last week. I was out of town coaching a high school basketball tournament, and I missed you guys. I really missed you guys. Bruce, how are you doing this morning?
If I get rid of my drainage, I'm okay. I had to find some fisherman's friend. If you've not heard of that, Ron, that's a very, very strong cough drop here in East Tennessee. I was proud to hear your team did better this year, Tony.
We did better. We didn't do great, but we did better.
Yeah. Because I know how you did, and it was rough.
Thanks a lot.
He thinks you won a game or two.
We won a game or two in the regular season.
Yeah. You did much better overall.
13 games in the regular season.
I thought you meant NACA.
I thought he was referring to NACA as well.
Okay.
We did do better than last year.
That's good.
At NACA. Yeah.
You got a young team,
you still have a perfect record then?
What's that?
You still have a perfect record in the tournament?
If perfect record means not winning any games, yeah, we're still unwinning in the tournament. Yeah.
Keep that slate clean. That's good.
Who needs enemies? Friends like Bruce.
That's right.
I mean, who needs them?
You're so uplifting to me. Hey, so guys, I'm excited for our episode today. We've had this one on the calendar for a long, long time. When we were researching who do we want to bring onto the show, who would be like the epitome of the guest to bring on that would be great for our audience to listen, I came across Ron and his work in life and his book Maximize, and it was one of those that I just took a flyer and I said, I'm going to reach out to this guy. He has no clue who I am, and see if maybe at some point I can get a response from him. And he responded to my email. And so we had a conversation about what we're doing here on the Small Church Podcast. And he graciously said, yeah, I'll be willing to come on and talk to you guys and impart my knowledge and wisdom and years of expertise on our listeners. So we are thrilled to join on the Small Church Podcast to welcome onto our show Ron Klassen. Ron, how are you doing this morning?
Oh, doing just great, and just so grateful for the opportunity and privilege it is to talk to some kindred spirits in small church ministry, and to have listeners out there that are kindred spirits as well. There's nothing I enjoy in ministry more than just talking to folks who are in small churches, whether it be pastors, leaders, or just regular attenders in the pews.
Yeah, so Ron, you talk about this a lot in your book, and we'll get into that, but you've been a lifer in small church ministry, but that wasn't originally your thought, your aspirations, or your intentions.
Very much not so. My wife and I grew up in Phoenix. We grew up in a mega church, and we just assumed after seminary that we would land maybe in a big church, maybe number 5 guy on a church staff or something like that. Our final year of seminary, and we started looking for opportunities. We found almost nothing in the big church world, but we found all kinds of opportunities to be solo pastors in small churches. And that was quite an adjustment for us in our thought processes. And the placement director at our seminary said, "Ron, let's have a cup of coffee." And I said, "I'm not ready to be a solo pastor." And he said, "Well, if you're going to wait until you're ready, you're never going to pastor a church." And so the short of it is we ended up in a small church in a small community in Nebraska, and that began a 40-year pilgrimage in small church, small community ministry.
That's exciting. So what inspired you to write this book, Maximize, leveraging the strengths of your small church?
Well, one was just the background that I just shared with our big church, big city background. As you can imagine, when we found ourselves in a small community and small church, pretty quickly things there just didn't measure up to what we were accustomed to. And so my almost knee-jerk reaction was to try to fix things, which for me meant trying to make my small church operate like a big church. And you can just imagine how well that went. So one of my motivations behind writing Maximize was simply to help others navigate their way from big to small. And statistics show that there is a significant percentage of new pastors in particular who come from big church backgrounds that find themselves in solo pastorates in smaller churches. I was also motivated by just the exposure that I've had to small churches all across the country. After pastoring for several years, God led us to RHMA, which is a ministry that's focused on smaller churches and smaller communities. And for 3 decades, I have had the privilege of traveling all across our country to all 50 states, many of the Canadian provinces. And along the way, I have experienced all kinds of just really good small churches. And at some point, I realized that, there are not very many people on the planet who have the privilege of being in as many small churches as me. And so I just started taking notes, kind of journaling, and Maximize essentially is just making order of those notes. So I wrote Maximize because I wanted to share with readers the best of what small churches from all across the country have to offer. And hopefully that comes through loud and clear in the book. And then just along the way, I have had all kinds of moments of special inspiration as I've rubbed shoulders with small church people and people that are located in smaller communities especially. And those moments of inspiration just pop up in Maximize time and again. One prime example, which was a key motivator behind me writing the book, was for years now, our ministry has taken seminary students on tours of a nearby thriving hospital in a small town. This hospital is so unique. It's small in size, but is an incredible place. This hospital is located 30 minutes from the premier downstate hospital in Illinois, where we live. And yet people regularly drive by this big hospital, go 30 minutes out into the country, and become patients at this smaller hospital located in Hopedale, Illinois. And we love to take our seminary students there. It's so inspiring. And what makes it inspiring is the person who has led our tours over the years. His name is Mark Rossi, and he is so passionate about what he's doing. It's just absolutely contagious. And at some point in the tour, inevitably, Mark will say something like, "We exploit the fact that we are small and rural." And that really stands out. We don't apologize for it. We don't downplay it. We don't excuse it. We exploit it. And Mark just loves to talk about how people in their hospital receive personal care. He talks about how the doctors and nurses know them by name. He talks about how, though they're small, it's still a high quality care that they receive. They're still on the cutting edge. This hospital regularly receives 5-star ratings. It's just an incredible place. He talks about how the doctors in this medical complex, they remain the doctors of their patients when they go into the hospital, which is pretty rare in today's world. He talks about the low staff to patient ratio. And then somewhere along the way will be the clincher. He will take our students into one of the patient rooms, and there's a huge window. Virtually an entire wall is a window. There's a rural landscape outside. It's peaceful. It's calming. It's so healing. There's just so much to exploit about that place. And our students get it. At some point along the way, they're starting to connect some dots and realize that there is so much that's transferable here to small church ministry. So instead of just looking at weaknesses and limitations that we feel sometimes in small churches, instead of trying to emulate big churches, which that doesn't usually go very well, Mark in our tours has helped us to see that small size is not a problem that needs to be solved, but it's a strategic advantage that God wants us to use. And I wrote Maximize because I wanted readers to be similarly inspired.
I love that. And I love you tell that story at the beginning of your book. And I loved the idea of let's not just accept the fact that we're a small church. Let's exploit it. That there are distinct advantages of being a small church, things that you can do in a small church that you can't do in a larger sized church. Tell us a little bit about Rural Home mission that you've been working with for the last several, I guess, decades, right?
Yeah, I had the privilege of serving as executive director of RHMA for almost 34 years. Just recently became director emeritus, which means I think that I'm old. I finally arrived.
Congratulations.
So RHMA, RHMA, and we call it RHMA, Rural Home Missionary Association, is kind of a mouthful. So RHMA's mission is to plant and strengthen churches in small towns. And we have a multifaceted ministry. And our headquarters is in Morton, Illinois. And that's where I'm speaking from right now. And that's where a lot of ministry happens that brings us or takes us to small churches and small communities all across the country. We have a great team of staff that work together in the home office, and we have staff that are located across the country that are involved in church planting and church strengthening ministries.
That's great. One of the things I want to point out before we go any further, and you make a point of this in your book, is that while a lot of your experience is with smaller communities, rural communities, the principles and the ideals that you talk about in your book are not driven by geography. That the same ideals apply if you're in a small church in a big city as opposed to in a rural area.
Yes, and coming to that realization was why I didn't actually put small town or small community in the title of the book, because over the years I've had the privilege of being in many small churches in larger contexts, and I've rubbed shoulders with pastors, especially at conferences where perhaps I'm speaking or leading seminars, and many of them are from bigger contexts, still small church, but larger contexts, and I believe that Maximize is very, very helpful. It has helpful information for pastors in small churches, leaders in small churches, no matter where those churches might be located.
And I think a lot of the things that you discuss in your book are beneficial to pastors and ministry leaders that are in larger churches. I think you have a lot of insights there that are not driven based on size of congregation, but they're just great ministry thoughts, just great ministry tools. Yeah, so I want to thank you for that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the big things, and I was telling Tony this before we got on, Ron, is that like one of the things you said that really inspired me, and I've actually used this a couple of times, is you talked about the fact that when you're in a small church, that like people, because at any church, sometimes you go in, the pastor starts to teach and preach the Bible, and you go, wow, he's really preaching to me today. But in a small church, people start to go, he is actually preaching to me today. I talked to him a week ago. He knows I'm going through this struggle, and he wrote a sermon towards me. And I hadn't processed some of that. Like there's people in your brain as you're teaching the Bible and preaching through things that you go, hey, I know someone's struggling with this, and it drives you to pray, but you don't. I mean, I don't know. I'm sure somebody does. I've never written a sermon that way, but you get to that point, and you're like, so I've actually looked at people and I've gone, hey, thank you for sharing that with me. I know what the next 5 weeks of sermons are, and you're going to feel like this is geared at you. And I just need you to know, like, don't leave the church. Like, I don't have time to write a sermon just for you. Come talk to me. If you feel something hits really hard, really personal, like, let's have a coffee. Let's sit down in my office. Let's do something to work through this, because I value what you said. And it was some things you said there. To get back to Tony's large church thing, I think that the people in large churches feel the same way. It's just they feel like they can hide. And in a small church, you can't. I mean, yeah. I think we walk in every day. And that was really like a pivotal point in the book for me, that I really have sat on some about, man, when you've got 80 adults in your auditorium every week, they know, like, you know them. They know you, and it's pretty intimate.
Yeah, that's great. Ron, there's we talked about before we went to you on the show that I coach high school basketball, as well as working with churches and doing this show. And this past week, we were at the National Association for Christian Athletics tournament in Dayton, Tennessee. And our first game, my boys, that I don't have a single senior on my squad. We have 2 juniors, and the rest are all underclassmen playing a varsity basketball schedule. My tallest player is 6'1", maybe 6'2", in stilts. And we take the court for our first game. And the team that we're playing, that we're matched up against in our first competition, every single player on their team is taller than my tallest guy. They had a couple of guys that were 6'5", 6'8". They're just beasts. They're grown men. Some of them are covered in tattoos. Some of them have beards. Some of them had kids running around, grandkids. And before the game even started, my boys had lost the game. They spent more time in pregame warm-ups staring at the other players and marveling at their size, their athleticism, and their strength. So much so that I had to stop our pregame warm-up, huddle my boys up, and say, mentally, you're already checked out. And I think that's a problem that a lot of small church pastors have, is they get to this place, they take their position, they accept a job, maybe right out of Bible college or seminary, and they get here and they see the other churches around them that have these incredible facilities, these great budgets. They're driving a brand new church van, and then they're seeing that they don't have the resources, they don't have the budget, they don't have the people to compete with the larger church, and they're already defeated from the beginning. One of the things that I loved about your book is you broke it into two parts, and the entire first part was changing that mindset. It was that we have to understand that just because you're small doesn't mean you're lesser than. Just because you're small doesn't mean that you can't do big things for the kingdom, and that God isn't just as present in and through your church as in larger churches. Can you take just a minute and talk about how the vast majority of our listeners are small church pastors and small church leaders, how they can overcome some of those challenges that we tend to take on, maybe put on ourselves as small church leaders?
Well, it's so tempting when especially if you're in the shadow of a mega church, to compare and to try to emulate. And I think both of those are problematic. And so I think it's really helpful for small church pastors and leaders to, first of all, gain a sense of what God's perspective is on their church, so that they can start seeing their church as God sees their church, and then and then work at trying to be the church that makes sense that they be, given the people that they have in their congregation, the people that make up their church. So start, I think, first with God's perspective on the church. And I think there's probably no better text for that than Zechariah chapter 4 of all places. So the context here is a smaller temple that's being built after the Jews return from captivity. And the book of Ezra tells us that the people were very eager to begin worshiping together again. They hadn't after being in for 70 years of captivity. And so one of the first things they did was to start rebuilding their temple. But after the foundation was laid, there was a really bad day for everybody. They just looked at that foundation and they started to weep. And they were weeping because they realized that this new church, this new temple, actually was not going to be anything like the former temple. And a big part of that was the size. It was just not going to be palatial. It was not going to be massive like their former temple, Solomon's temple. And in that context, Zechariah provides, or God raised up Zechariah, I should say, to address that very situation of people feeling that their small church, their small temple was inferior to the previous temple. And there are two really important perspectives that Zechariah provides. One is, he says, it's not by might nor by power, but by my spirit that we should be operating in our church or in our temple. And that's such a great perspective. When you think about it, bigness alone is not equivalent to vibrant and healthy and just a great environment for learning and discipleship. And that was true of Solomon's former temple. That was, in their latter days, was not an exemplary kind of temple. And so what's really important is whether God's Spirit is active in our congregation. And the perspective that Zechariah brings is that God doesn't dole out his Spirit in proportion to the size of the temple, or in our case, the size of the church. So we can have every bit as much of God's Spirit working in our small church as we might find perhaps in bigger churches. And then the second perspective that Zechariah offers is that we should not despise small things. And small thing in that context was the smaller temple. So we should not look down on our small temple, on our small church. That's not what God does when he looks at us, and we should not as well. And if we can just reorientate our thinking to how God thinks about our church and our community, I think that'll take us a long way toward having a healthy small church ministry.
I was sitting with a pastor back in the fall, and we were just talking through a couple of things around smaller churches versus larger churches, and he said, I have a real fondness, and I am thankful for some of the mega churches, and he's in Atlanta, he's in a really big area, and I'm thankful for the mega churches, the larger churches, because there's people who come to our church who sit in a smaller community that wouldn't have taken a step into our church because it's small and it's intimate. But he said they were willing to kind of get in the back door and kind of sit in a large crowd and hide for a year, hide for 6 months, and just listen. And the Holy Spirit worked. And then they went, okay, this was great. And then they've moved to a smaller community to where they, and I think there's some mega churches doing amazing jobs with small groups. So if somebody's at a mega church and you're like, we're the best small group, you might be, you probably are. I'm not saying that, but there is something about, and I think all of us in this podcast would agree, there's something unique and special about a small church when it comes to community, and there's a uniqueness. And if that community isn't clicking for you in a larger church, there is a real chance in a smaller church it will. And this guy was just talking through the things you're saying, that like, hey, in this smaller ministry, there is such a space for discipleship and spiritual formation and caring for each other and loving each other in a way that just feels very different than the large church. The principles carry, but there is something unique. And my wife loves it. She's like, I would never want you to pastor a church over 150 people ever. She's like, I love where we are. I love what we do. She never wants to leave where we are, and I don't either. But like, she's like, I love this 100 to 150 range. It is just a beautiful space. We sit with people. They come to our house. We disciple. We have friends who are willing to come in and kind of sit and journey through some real hurt and stuff because they know that we're willing to sit with them, that you're just not up on stage and then you're going to disappear to a green room, which again, I've been to churches where I've disappeared to green rooms. Nothing wrong with that. It's just not my style.
I really enjoyed my green room.
They are pretty. They're not green.
I liked snacks.
We have donuts in our church.
I think I would want to quickly say that in no way does maximize disparage large churches.
Agreed.
I'm so very thankful for large churches. I'm so thankful for the church that Roxy and I were part of during our growing up years. It has had continues to have profound effect on our lives. So we're not here to disparage large churches at all. But as you've said, there are some distinct advantages to being in smaller churches. And if we just simply work at maximizing and leveraging some of those examples, we can find ourselves in a pretty healthy, vibrant community of worshipers. And that's the goal of that behind me writing Maximize.
No, well, I was just going to say, kind of with that, you're absolutely right, and we need mega large churches. We need that medium-sized church, and I loved how you said in your book, we need normal-sized churches, because the average church is just, and Tony, you say this all the time, is way less than 150 people, and so that is what we need. That we need all three, because the goal should be that all of us are partners in ministry to come alongside each other for the greater purpose of the kingdom. And so I agree. Thanks for clarifying that, because I definitely did not mean, if I did, to say that Maximize maybe pushes, back or pushes off on larger or mid-sized churches, because I definitely feel like all three of those are necessary for the kingdom to move forward.
Yep. Ron, you talk a lot in your book about strengths-based ministry and the unique strengths and advantages that the small church has, and exploiting those advantages, to go back to the story of the hospital administrator. Can you I'm sure we have some listeners that are listening to this saying, you don't know my church. You haven't sat in my church. I don't know what strengths we have, and I don't know what's there to exploit. Can you take a few minutes and talk about some of the strengths, the benefits of the small church in your years of seeing different small churches in every state?
Yeah, so much to say and so little time to say it, right? I think that maybe we could start with what I think is the most noteworthy strength of a healthy small church, and that is that it's personal and relational. And I think we've already hinted at this already in our conversations. If you ask small church people what they like about their church, they will just talk about how much they enjoy being together, how friendly their church is, how they care for each other, how they know each other by name, how they enjoy just simply doing life together in community. And interestingly, if you ask them about their pastor, they may not even talk about his preaching. Not that they don't think preaching is important, but that's maybe not the first thing that they think about when they talk about their pastor. They might talk about how personable he is, how friendly, how caring, how he shepherded them through a difficult time in their lives. And this is a strength that I think can be leveraged in lots of ways in small church ministry and become something that the church is known for. Several years ago, I had the privilege of doing some interim preaching in a church a couple hours from here that was in between pastors. And so I was with them on a number of Sundays for a period of time. And my family was very engaged in our local church and had responsibilities there. So they didn't come with me. So I would come home after being in this church on a Sunday, and we'd be chatting together about my experience there. And quickly they realized that, wow, this is a really great church. And finally, at some point, I was able to take my wife and me with me to that church, and just so they could experience it for themselves. And I was kind of holding my breath, hoping that church would be everything that Sunday that I had been talking about that it was, and it truly was. I mean, the church was so friendly, so outgoing, just so full of hugs and laughter. There was such a warmth there. There was so much just spontaneity, and just could tell that they just really enjoyed being together, enjoyed being just a family, worshiping together in that community. And it was interesting as we returned home, Roxy, my wife, said, I'd like to be a part of that church as much as a big church. And that was no small thing for her to say, because remember, she grew up in a big church and she knows all the strengths and good things about big churches. And yet she was so taken away by what we experienced that Sunday in that small church that she could see some real advantages toward being there. So it's very possible that small churches can be very appealing and can have high impact ministries, and it can happen even in the shadow of a big church.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that we've talked about several times on this show before, we even did a couple of episodes in going back and referencing Eugene Peterson's old book, Working the Angles, and the 3 angles of pastoral ministry. So you've got the pastoral side of things, just shepherding your flock, caring for people, really being a pastor. You've got the leadership aspect, and you've got the preaching, teaching aspect. And we've talked on this show about which one of those, because nobody other than Jesus was great at all three of those, but they're all three, except for Robert as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
They're but you have to do all of them
Yeah.
in ministry. They're all an important component, but yet there's one that usually stands out as your strong point, your strength. And depending on the size of your church, when we're helping churches look for a new pastor, a new minister, we talk through this ideal with them and then say which of those three is most important to you in this hire. With a lot of guys that we see, especially younger guys coming into ministry, fresh out of Bible college or seminary, if you were to ask them this question, they would say that pastoral care is not their strong suit. It's amazing, and a lot of it has to do with just the world that we live in now with social media and so much of life taking place behind closed doors and online, that the personal relational aspect, building and developing relationships, seems to be a skill that a lot of younger people either are missing or just don't enjoy. And so for a small church to be to utilize and maximize that strength of the advantage of being relational, if their pastor, if their minister isn't a relational person, how can they overcome that?
Good question. And I hear pastors all the time say or ask similar questions. Interestingly, a high percentage of pastors would see themselves as introverts, not as extroverts.
Right.
And so they don't see one of their strengths as being relational. And I can relate to that. I tend to be a task-oriented kind of guy, more administrative-minded, more into leadership, more into preaching, and, that shepherding, pastoral care, relating part of ministry does not come natural to me. But, I think we can learn and grow in this area. And I think at first, at least, it may just require an extra dose of intentionality. And as we are intentional about it, at some point, it'll become much more natural for us, something that we're more inclined to do. So, for instance, for me, in order to be more relational and more caring, I would actually schedule times on my calendar for that, because I respond to my calendar, being the task-oriented guy. So I just turned relationships into tasks. And so I would schedule showing up at the local cafe 2 or 3 times a week for coffee, just to sit and chat with the men that show up at various times in the cafe. I would schedule times to go and visit specific people in my congregation or in the community. I prayed through our church directory. It was a paper copy back in the day, so I could easily take it and pray through it. And I tried to be intentional as I was praying to just think about what the people are going through in their lives. What do I know about what's happening? And that's one of the advantages of being in a smaller church. Generally, you know. And as I'm praying, if things came to mind, I would often just stop and make a phone call, or maybe write a note, and just let them know that I'm thinking about them and praying for them. Or I might make a note on my calendar for the next Sunday when I run into them in church, be prepared to ask them a question about something that's going on in their lives. And, people, I think, at first, they probably thought, well, that's just Ron being a caring, kind of spontaneous guy. And the truth was that at first it wasn't. At first it was me trying to be disciplined and intentional. But over time, I came to the place where I realized, you know what? I love going to have coffee with the guys. And I love times in the hospital when I can visit with people. I love those opportunities to jump in a semi with one of my farmers as he's hauling corn to town or something like that, and just have moments for conversation. And so I didn't have to be as intentional about it because it came a lot more naturally. So it's something that we can grow into. I don't think we necessarily have to have as second nature being an extrovert, being personable. I think we can grow into it and become a good shepherd in that regard as well.
Bruce, I know that's your area of expertise there as well. Do you have anything that you would like to chime in on that?
Yeah, I don't consider myself an extrovert, but I just really like to get around and make sure people are noticed. And so when I get out of the car and going to church, Carol will see me when I get back in the car. And I'm just around trying to get around and see as many people, no matter what size church. I grew up in a large church, and my first ministry wasn't a large church. It was a small church. And I learned the value of relationships there. But I try to get around and hug people, touch people, check on people, find new people that I can strike a relationship with. And honestly, that's refreshing for me. For some people, it's difficult, but for me, that's even when I was teaching in college at Milligan, I hugged my students and told them, if you don't want to be hugged, don't get near me or slap me. But I'm a toucher, and that's the way things are. And I think Milligan became more of a hugging campus with me there, because a lot of other faculty I began to see hugging students. But at church, that's really, Ron, what I think my gift is the relational part. I'd like to say it's the organizational part, yeah, but it comes right down to it. What I really flesh out is the relational, the touch part, connecting people. Those are the things that really make me excited and keep the fires burning.
And, sometimes we find ourselves in churches that maybe don't have that friendly atmosphere that we've been talking about. But, over time, churches take on the personality or the persona of their pastor and their leaders. And I think just as we as pastors and leaders can learn how to be more relational, I think we can mentor that for our church as well. So some might be listening and saying, my church actually isn't all that friendly, and they don't necessarily get along real well with each other. Well, I think if we model that kind of relational health before our congregation, that they will take that on over a period of time, and our church will become known for being caring and friendly.
I agree. It's if you demonstrate it, you can talk about it, but you demonstrate it and people see it and they feel it. I think they begin to move in that kind of direction.
Yeah.
Ron, you give a lot of really practical tips for what small churches can do to maximize their impact around this idea of building relationships and being relational. One of the ones that I would love to have you touch on specifically is the idea of designing your worship services to reflect that relational aspect. Can you talk a little bit more about that and what that looks like?
Yeah, again, some intentionality I think is helpful here, especially for someone like myself. Now, if you're a pastor or leader who's just spontaneous and outgoing and it just comes supernatural, maybe you don't have to be quite as intentional. But I do think that we can design our worship services with the small church's relational strength in mind. And this can be just a lot of small things that are sprinkled through the service. It can happen through our announcements as we talk about things that are going on in the church. We can make them very personal. We can highlight things that have been happening in our church and community. Maybe the previous week, I was just listening to a small church pastor just yesterday on a walk, and he was congratulating the high school basketball team for the great season that they had. So there's ways, even in our announcements, we can be weaving in people and events that are happening in our community. I found that a greeting time in a small church can be incredible. I've seen some small churches that their greeting time lasts 5-10 minutes. A pastor friend of mine calls this the ministry of walking around. And people in small churches, when they say, well, how are you? That's not a perfunctory question. They really want to know. And during that greeting time, they can do a lot of caring for each other. And I found that could be really meaningful. I think praying times can be meaningful as well. We can be a lot more personable in our praying times. I'm thinking of a time years ago when our daughter broke her arm at school on a Friday afternoon. And I would highly advise anyone that if your daughter or son is going to break their arm, that they not do it on a Friday afternoon, because basically the ER said, we'll put you in a temporary cast and we'll do surgery on Monday. And Roxy and I were just lamenting, like we're losing all this time when healing could be happening. But there was kind of a special healing that happened on that Sunday morning. Our pastor, who was very personable, very caring, he invited all the kids up front for just a time just for them. And part of that time, he asked our daughter to move and sit beside him. And he said, well, you notice that Carissa has a cast on her arm, and she's going to be having surgery tomorrow. And we just want to take time to pray for her here during our worship service. And I can guarantee you at that moment, I was not saying, wow, I wish I was in a big church, because that's not something that would happen in a big church. Yeah. But we can have those caring kinds of moments in our worship services. It can happen with the music part of our worship services. They can be more folksy. They can be more spontaneous. They can involve different ages. We talk some about intergenerational ministry as being also a strength of smaller churches. And I've seen worship teams in small churches that have a younger child or two on the team. I've seen small churches sing some of the kids' songs right during the worship service. So, kids in the congregation are appreciating the fact that the service was designed with them in mind as well. And I think it's probably good to think about who our worship leader should be. I think we're kind of prone to think, well, it should be the best person musically, right, in our church. And I would push back a little bit and say, well, it's helpful to have a worship leader who can at least sing on pitch, so it's not a distraction. But the best worship leader might actually be someone who can draw worship out of people in the congregation, and that may not necessarily be your best musician. So there's all kinds of ways that we can design our worship services around that relational strength. And I think that can even happen in our preaching. I was struck some time ago by reading an article by Haddon Robinson on preaching. And he said, when I prepare sermons, I like to imagine that across from my desk, there are all kinds of people. There's a young person, there's a middle-aged, there's an older person, there's somebody who's going through a divorce, there's somebody whose mother's in the hospital. I just imagine all these people sitting on the other side of my desk, and they're asking the question, so what is the sermon going to say to me? And so we can be personable and relational in that we speak into all kinds of different life situations that are present in our church. And of course, because it's a small church, we know about those life situations. And so we can be very personal and relational even in our preaching.
I love that. One of the things that we hear from most churches that we work with, and we have the opportunity to sit down and work with a lot of churches and helping them to just develop plans and strategies for better reaching their community. And the first question that we ask is, what does your church do great? Not what do you do good, but what do you do great? And almost every single time their response is, well, we're incredibly friendly. We're a very friendly church, very friendly people. We're welcoming to everyone. So if every church feels that way, and a lot of times that's simply not the case, and we've talked about that before, that maybe you're friendly to the people that are a part of your church and that are inside of your church already, but when new people come in, you're not as friendly as you might think. Is there any kind of metric or measure that a church can use to identify and evaluate their relational effectiveness?
That's a good question. The thing that comes to mind immediately is to maybe invite somebody who you know to attend your church, somebody your church does not know, and kind of invite them to attend, sort of like a secret shopper.
Yeah.
And be there to evaluate the maybe all aspects of the church, but certainly the relational health of the church. I think some time ago I was speaking at a church. It was out in the middle of a cornfield, but it was not a small church. It probably had 150 people there that morning. And as I usually do, I got there a little bit early just to connect with people in charge and make sure the technical sides of things were working and whatever. And while I was doing that, my wife actually just started walking around the church, kind of going up and down the hallways, and there were people all around. It was kind of their social hour between Sunday school and church, so they were having coffee, they were eating donuts, they were talking to each other. And as we were driving home that day, my wife said to me, she said, I was probably walking around that church for about 20 minutes and not a single person said anything to me. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if that church would have said, we're friendly. But really what they meant was we're friendly with each other, right, but we're not necessarily friendly with outsiders. So that's the kind of thing that if you're an outsider, if you invite a secret shopper in, maybe some of that can be evaluated, and you can help your church, maybe beginning with the leadership, to work on maybe some of the weaknesses that might be present there and help turn them around and make them strengths.
I think people just underestimate sometimes that if you think about being a smaller church like where we are, 150 people, like you said there, not a small church, very normal, very, kind of almost a bigger church at times, is probably 40 families. And, if you've got 2 or 3 people in each family, kind of, people forget how quickly 4 or 5 families from the same family start to suck up that number of 40 families. And if you're treating it as a family reunion every week, we've talked about this before, Tony. I mean, like, you treat it as a family reunion every week, you very quickly, that person who's trying to figure out faith, trying to figure out life, your wife walking down the halls, I mean, who, they kind of knew who you were at least. I mean, they should have at least probably tried to be a little bit different. It's just a very different space of how quickly we become unaware that we aren't intentional about that, because we're hanging out with not just friends, but family that we've known our whole life.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. Robert, you've been excited about having Ron on for a couple months now.
I literally read the book between the week you gave it to us and the next week. I was like, have you read the book yet? And you're like, man, that's like 2 months out. I'll forget the whole book if I wait this long. And I'm like, well, I read it in like 2 days. So
yeah.
Here we go.
And so you've been excited to have Ron on for a while, and you've been uncharacteristically quiet today. So,
well, I'm taking notes. I mean, there's some things that he's reminded me of in so many things. Sorry, did you have a question there? like outside of me just starting to ramble?
No, I was just going to say you've been looking forward to having this discussion
I
with
have.
Ron for a while. I know that you've got a lot of notes there that you would love to
Well,
discuss with him.
I mean, there's four big things that stick out in my brain, and we've talked about some of these. The opening the opening paragraph there of talking through that highways have kind of bypassed towns immediately. My oldest son is 20, and the Cars movie was huge, and that was kind of the whole premise of that movie, and so that kind of sits in my head, and I'm going, man, I really see that, and I understand how that works. In chapter 2, you got to the space. I'm going to butcher his name. And you had the quote about basically the isolation communities, and I kind of talk about it in the terms of front porch and back porch communities. My grandparents grew up sitting on the front porch, drinking sweet tea and lemonade, eating cake with their neighbors. My parents built back porches and hid from everyone, isolated, and I was born in 75, so, I'll be 49 this year. And so that just to kind of, as I say those things, it helps you understand, I guess, generationally where I am. And when I talked a little bit about one of the things earlier, so I won't bring that back up. But I was reading through, though, and you were talking through something, and I had already written down Mark DeVries' Family-Based Youth Ministry, and 2 pages later, you mentioned Mark in your book, and just kind of that, I was just thinking through that one-eared Mickey Mouse and that intergenerational ministry. So those are 3 things that just really stood out to me in the book and challenged me as someone who has 50 to 60 families. We average 105, 110 people a week. We have about 15 students in our student ministry. My wife and I lead that as well. It's just like, I guess, are there any thoughts inside of those 2 or 3 things that I just mentioned that you're like, hey, here's some things that I would, that just, as you mentioned, that stick out to me since I've written the book. Here's things that have been important about that, or just on those topics.
Well, in one way or another, you've been talking around the strength of many small churches, which is that they are intergenerational. And I think that's something that we can really leverage and make into an even greater strength. That's something we can maximize in our small church ministry. You have all generations present, all of them interacting with each other, all of them benefiting each other. And I think that's huge. And the guy that you mentioned, his name is Randy Frazee. He wrote a book called The Connecting Church. And he is the first, and he may be the only megachurch pastor that I'm aware of that talks about how megachurches are inferior to smaller churches unless they start acting like smaller churches. And he went to great length to talk about how he would advocate doing that in big church ministry. It's really worth the read, called The Connecting Church by Randy Frazee. Encouraging reading, because usually it's the other way. We feel like we're inferior in our small churches and we just don't measure up. And here, Pastor Frazee is saying just the opposite. And I think one of the ways that we can really shine in our small churches is to make intergenerational ministry just a very intentional part of our church community. And again, sometimes we see this as a weakness. We're intergenerational because we're not big enough to segregate by ages. The bigger you are, the more you're likely to segregate by ages. And in our small church, we maybe don't have the staff to do that or the building. And so we are often together intergenerationally. And I guess what I would say is that's actually a good thing. And that's something that you can maximize and make a centerpiece of your small church ministry. Realize that there are incredible benefits to people of all ages relating to each other. I know as an older person, I love the energy and the life that younger ones bring, and I'd like to think those of us who are older maybe have some wisdom and some calm that we can bring in the difficult situations of life that people encounter. So there's all kinds of benefits to intergenerational relating. And I would just suggest that we make that a centerpiece of our ministry, that we help our people see that that's actually a strength, and that we want to maximize that strength as much as possible. And I also think it's biblical. The church is more the metaphor that's used, I think, more than any other for the church in the New Testament is family. And family, when you think about it, there's all ages involved, and even with extended family. So you have parents, you have kids, you have uncles and aunts, you have grandparents, and you may be in an extended family where you're the only person your age, and that's a good thing, and that's a biblical thing. That's the picture that the scriptures paint of a church family. And I just think that can be a guiding principle. It can be a missional thing for us to really lean into that intergenerational piece of ministry and make it a centerpiece of what we are as a church. It's interesting, and I think Mark DeVries brings this out. You mentioned him as writing a book on youth ministry. He provides some statistics that show that children and youth that are assimilated into the church, rather than going down a hall into their separate ministry, but they're actually assimilated into the church, are much more likely to remain in the church after they outgrow their children and youth ministries. Whereas large churches may have hundreds of teens coming to their youth ministries, but when they become 20-somethings, sadly, a huge percentage of those leave the church because they've not been assimilated into the church. That's something we can do in our small church ministries.
No, that is so good, and a great reminder for me. It's such a different mentality. I mentioned the one-eared Mickey Mouse. I love that idea of the fact that, or just the visual. I mean, for this idea and concept that mainly in the 70s, Mark talks about that we took everybody without a brain and the one person who could play guitar and stay up all night for a lock-in and put them in one room, and then everybody with a brain we left in another room. And Tony, you and I have talked about this. I know you've read this book and stuff as well. And we said, good luck. And then we wondered why students didn't want to reconnect, because we created their own church, their own environment that wasn't a part. And this is something Bruce and Tony and I have talked about as well, is the grandparenting part of things. Is this mentality of sugar them up and send them home is not biblical. That God sets very clearly in Deuteronomy, and continues that on throughout Scripture, that grandparents have a very specific role in the discipling of their grandchildren, and I think that the church needs to and should, and for me, like I said, this is a challenge: adopt and adapt to how we use each generation to encourage, equip, and move the kingdom forward, as we disciple and help each believer as they spiritual formation and spiritual discipleship and stuff. I'm just such a good thought there. I love how you just again really encouraging for me. No one else that listens to this may get anything, but again, I'm excited to go work today when I'm done with this.
That word disciple is so key. And I would like to think there is a discipleship advantage in small church ministry, because I don't think a lot of discipleship is necessarily opening a book or reading a book together and talking about it. It can certainly be that, but a lot of discipleship, I think, is life on life, just doing life together And that's what happens in a small church. And I don't think it's any mistake or any coincidence that a disproportionately high number of people that are in serving as missionaries, as pastors, and other kinds of Christian vocational ministries come from smaller churches. And I think that's because they've been discipled almost from day one in an intergenerational.
Yeah, and I mean, and that's so good. I mean, if we look at Jesus, who's supposed to be our model, he grabbed 12 guys, and I know there was some other people floating around, and they literally followed him around. I mean, they hung out with him, they ate together, they slept together, they worshiped together, they laughed together. I mean, they went through every part of life, and their life formed around the fact of their teacher, their rabbi, and there is, if we've always told our boys, like, you need to understand that the people who are ahead of you know what you're going through, and if you can't talk to us about that, there's, you need to find someone you can. And we've done our best to then, of course, direct them, not force them. It needs to be their idea. And they're like, I was thinking about talking to so-and-so or so-and-so. And then they give you two names and you're going, okay, that was the one I was thinking about. So how do I let you choose that person? But we need that wisdom, and we need that a teacher and a person who is modeling and living that out, that we can journey some life with, to just pick up from the things they're doing. No, that's so good.
Yeah. Well, Ron, we are about out of time. How can people find and pick up a copy of your book?
Probably the easiest way is to go to Amazon and just look up Maximize there. It'll pop right up. The cheapest way is to go to our ministry website, which is simply rhma.org. And you can click on resources and you can order the book from there. It'll save you a few dollars if you go through our ministry website.
That's great. Well, Ron, you have a few hundred small church pastors, small church leaders that are listening to you right now. You have any closing thoughts, things that you would love to say to them?
All kinds of things. I just want to thank you who are serving in smaller churches for your faithfulness. It is so encouraging. I think small churches are repositories of faithful people. And I just so appreciate you who are willing to serve out of the spotlight. Your names may not be known beyond the county line, but I assure you that God knows your name, and the people in your church appreciate you, and your ministry is really significant. And I think if there's anything I could do that could most help would be to point all of our listeners to the letter of Paul to the Colossians. Colossae was the smallest town that Paul wrote to in the New Testament. There was a house church there, so it was a small church. And Paul is gushing with praise about this small church. And he also focuses on the faithfulness of their key leader, which I'm guessing most of us who are listening don't even know his name. But Paul has all kinds of good things to say. So I would encourage the listeners just to read through the entire letter of Paul to the Colossians through small church lenses, realizing that's who Paul is talking to. And I assure you that you will be greatly encouraged.
Awesome. Well, that's all the time that we have for this edition of the Small Church Podcast. We want to thank you for joining us, and we hope that you found this episode insightful, enlightening, and maybe a little bit entertaining. I want to especially thank our guest, Ron Klassen, for joining us today and giving his insights. If you would like to connect with Ron, you can do so at rhma.org. You can also find his book, Maximize, Leveraging the Strengths of Your Small Church, at the RHMA website, or on Amazon.com. You can find a link to that in our show notes. We want to remind you to subscribe to the Small Church Podcast so that you never miss an episode and you can stay connected with our ever-growing community. Love what you heard? Like, share, and follow us on social media. You can find us on Facebook, look for Higher Ministries, or visit us at higherministries.com. I want to again thank you for being a part of the Small Church Podcast, and stay tuned for another episode next Tuesday. Always remember, your small church can have a big impact. Have a great week.